Have you ever opened your investment account late at night after a long, exhausting day of work and suddenly realized that the market quietly added more money to your portfolio in a single year than you managed to save through 12 months of discipline, budgeting, and sacrifice? Because that exact moment is the invisible turning point where wealth stops being something you chase and begins transforming into something that slowly and relentlessly begins working for you. There was a man I once knew who owned a small manufacturing business in Ohio, the kind of business that never appears in headlines or podcasts about billionaires, but quietly supports a family, employs a few people, and slowly builds stability through years of showing up every morning and solving problems that nobody else wants to deal with. For most of his adult life, he followed the classic financial advice that everyone repeats, which meant saving aggressively through his 40s, contributing consistently to his retirement accounts, avoiding unnecessary lifestyle inflation, and believing that if he stayed disciplined long enough, the system would eventually reward his patience. By the time he reached the age of 52, his retirement portfolio had grown to roughly $400,000, which felt like a respectable accomplishment, but still seemed far away from the magical financial freedom number that people imagine when they think about retirement. Then one completely ordinary afternoon, he logged into his investment account to review his yearly performance summary, and something unexpected caught his attention in a way that made him pause and stare at the screen for several seconds longer than usual. The market had generated nearly $40,000 in growth for his portfolio during that year alone, which meant that his investments had quietly produced almost twice as much money as he had personally managed to contribute through months of careful saving and discipline. He leaned back in his chair and said something that almost nobody thinks to say at the exact right moment in their financial life. He asked himself a question that sounds simple but changes everything once you truly understand what it means. What exactly am I doing here if my money is already working harder than I am? That moment right there is the exact moment we are talking about today, because it represents the precise crossover point where your contributions stop being the primary driver of your wealth and compounding begins taking control of the entire system. Most people believe that building wealth requires relentless effort until the age of 65, because they assume that every year of contributions is equally important and that stopping early would somehow destroy their entire financial plan. But the truth is that wealth does not grow in a straight line, and it certainly does not depend on your effort forever, because at some point, the mathematics of compounding becomes stronger than your ability to save money through work alone. To understand how this happens, imagine that building wealth is like pushing an enormous stone wheel up a hill, while gravity constantly tries to pull it back down. In the early years, you are doing nearly all the work yourself because the wheel is heavy, slow, and stubborn, which means every paycheck you invest feels like a small push that barely moves the system forward. You might spend years saving money and watching your portfolio grow slowly, while wondering whether the entire strategy is even working, because progress during the early phase of investing often feels painfully slow and sometimes discouraging. But something fascinating begins to happen after enough years of consistency and patience, because the wheel slowly starts to rotate with slightly less resistance than before. At first, the movement is subtle and almost unnoticeable, yet with every year of disciplined investing, the rotation becomes smoother and the momentum becomes stronger. Eventually, the wheel reaches a speed where it begins moving partly on its own energy, rather than depending entirely on your effort to keep it rolling forward. And that moment is where the entire psychology of investing begins to change in a powerful way. Let's look at the actual numbers to understand why this transformation happens faster than most people expect. Imagine you are investing $20,000 every year while earning an average annual return of 7% from the market. In the early stage of your journey, when your portfolio only contains $100,000, a 7% return produces about $7,000 in annual growth, which means your $20,000 contribution is still responsible for most of the progress happening in your account. At this stage, you are clearly the engine of the system, because your contributions are doing the majority of the work, while compounding quietly plays a supporting role in the background. But as the portfolio grows, something subtle begins to change that most people fail to notice until they run the numbers carefully. When your portfolio reaches $300,000 invested, that same 7% return suddenly produces roughly $21,000 in annual growth without you doing anything at all. This is the moment when the market begins contributing almost the exact same amount of money to your portfolio as you are contributing through your savings. You are no longer pushing the wheel alone, because compounding has begun sharing the responsibility for moving the system forward. And once the portfolio eventually grows to $500,000, the numbers become even more interesting. 7% growth on $500,000 produces $35,000 in gains. Within a single year, which means the market is now contributing significantly more money to your portfolio than your annual $20,000 contribution. At that point, the balance of power has completely shifted because compounding has officially become the dominant force driving your wealth forward. You are no longer the engine pushing the wheel, because the wheel is already spinning with enough momentum to move largely on its own. When your portfolio eventually reaches $1 million, the mathematics become almost unbelievable for someone who has never experienced compounding in real life. A 7% return on $1 million produces $70,000 in growth within a single year, which makes a $20,000 contribution look almost insignificant compared to the power of the system already in motion. That is the moment when investors begin realizing something that changes their entire relationship with work, savings, and financial freedom. Their money is officially working harder than they are. For years, they felt like they were carrying the entire burden of their financial future through discipline and sacrifice. Yet suddenly the system begins helping them in a meaningful way. The anxiety that once accompanied every financial decision begins to fade because the portfolio itself is now generating momentum that cannot easily be stopped. This is what many experienced investors refer to as reaching financial escape velocity, because once your portfolio reaches this level of momentum, the mathematics of compounding begin pulling you toward your long-term goals almost automatically. The real beauty of understanding this crossover point is that it gives you a clear target, instead of forcing you to blindly save until an arbitrary retirement age that may or may not actually matter for your personal situation. You are no longer saving money simply because someone told you that retirement happens at 65. Instead, you are aiming for a specific portfolio size where the market begins doing more work than you do. Once you reach that number, you suddenly have options that most people never realize exist. You could continue contributing aggressively and reach your financial goals even faster, if that aligns with your priorities. Or you could choose to ease off the accelerator and allow compounding to carry you forward, while you redirect your energy toward other areas of life that matter to you. Some people use that freedom to start businesses that excite them, even if those ventures produce less income. Others transition into lower stress careers that provide more time with family or more flexibility in their daily schedules. And some people simply continue working exactly as before but with a completely different mindset, because they know they are no longer trapped in the system. The most powerful insight here is that financial freedom is not always about reaching the final destination as quickly as possible. Sometimes it is about reaching the moment where the system becomes strong enough that you can finally breathe, step back, and allow time and mathematics to finish the journey for you. That moment is the crossover point where your money begins working harder than you do. And once you reach it, the entire game of building wealth transforms from a constant uphill struggle into a powerful engine that quietly moves forward on its own momentum while you simply guide the direction of the now. Imagine standing at that moment in your financial life when the realization finally settles in that the system you have been feeding for years has grown powerful enough to operate almost independently, because that realization does not arrive like fireworks or a dramatic life event, but rather like a quiet understanding that slowly expands in your mind as you look at the numbers and realize that the effort you once believed would last forever is beginning to fade into the background. For most people, the early years of investing feel like walking through a dense fog where progress is difficult to see and motivation can easily disappear, because every dollar saved feels small compared to the size of the goals they imagine decades in the future, which makes the entire journey feel abstract and distant, even though every small action is quietly building the foundation of something much larger. This is why the early phase of wealth building requires an unusual level of patience that very few people naturally possess, because during those first years the results rarely match the effort, and the temptation to abandon the strategy appears constantly in the form of lifestyle upgrades, short-term spending, and the feeling that life is passing by while you continue delaying gratification. But hidden beneath that slow and often frustrating beginning is a mathematical engine that becomes stronger every year you refuse to quit, because every dollar invested is not simply sitting idle, but multiplying quietly through the same exponential principles that drive growth in nature, technology, and entire economies. Compounding is often described with simple formulas and charts, yet the real power of it only becomes emotionally real when you begin seeing the results appear inside your own account statements, year after year, because numbers that once seemed theoretical start transforming into actual financial momentum that affects your decisions and your confidence. There is a fascinating psychological shift that occurs when investors begin noticing that the market occasionally produces gains larger than their yearly contributions, because that moment breaks the illusion that wealth only grows through constant effort and reveals that time itself is becoming your most valuable financial asset. When this happens, your perspective on money slowly evolves from one focused entirely on income and saving to one focused on systems and long-term leverage, because you begin realizing that the real goal was never simply to earn more money but to build a structure capable of producing growth without constant supervision. Many experienced investors describe this transition as the moment they stop thinking like employees and start thinking like owners of capital, because once you own enough productive assets, the relationship between time, effort, and income begins shifting in ways that traditional careers rarely provide. Think again about that massive stone we talked about earlier, because it represents the entire philosophy behind long-term investing in a way that simple spreadsheets cannot fully capture. At the beginning, the wheel is heavy, slow, and stubborn, forcing you to apply nearly all the energy required to move it even a few inches forward, while gravity constantly tries to drag it back down the hill. Each paycheck invested feels like a small push that barely changes anything in the short term, and during those early years you may question whether the wheel will ever truly gain momentum. But what most people fail to realize is that the first stage of pushing the wheel is not about speed or immediate results, but about building inertia, because once an object with enough mass begins moving consistently, it becomes increasingly difficult to stop. Financial momentum works exactly the same way, because every year of disciplined investing increases the size of the wheel and strengthens the force of compounding acting upon it. Eventually, the system reaches a stage where even small market returns produce meaningful gains, simply because the base of invested capital has grown large enough to amplify every percentage of growth. This is why experienced investors often say that the first $100,000 is the hardest milestone to reach, because during that phase the wheel is still gaining its initial momentum, and every dollar contributed feels essential to the process. Once that threshold is crossed, the dynamics begin shifting gradually, because the portfolio itself starts producing noticeable results through compounding, making the next 100,000 arrive faster than the first. Then the next stage becomes even more interesting, because as the numbers grow larger, the time required to double your wealth often becomes shorter than you originally expected. This phenomenon surprises many investors, because their intuition is trained to think in straight lines rather than exponential curves, which makes it difficult to visualize how growth accelerates once enough capital accumulates. For example, someone with $50,000 invested might feel that reaching 100,000 will take many years of discipline, yet someone who already holds 500,000 may see that same 50,000 increase appear in their portfolio through market growth alone. During a strong year, that difference is not the result of working harder or saving more aggressively, but simply the natural consequence of compounding operating on a larger base of capital. Understanding this concept changes the way you evaluate your progress, because instead of focusing solely on the next paycheck, you begin paying attention to the size of the system you are building and the rate at which it multiplies over time. This is also why many investors eventually realize that consistency is more important than perfection when it comes to building wealth. Trying to predict every market movement or chase the highest performing assets often leads to unnecessary risk and emotional stress, whereas maintaining a steady strategy over decades allows compounding to operate without interruption. Markets will rise and fall during that journey, sometimes dramatically, yet the long-term trend of productive economies has historically continued upward. As businesses innovate, populations grow, and technology improves productivity across industries, investors who remain patient during downturns often discover that volatility becomes less intimidating once their portfolios reach substantial size, because they understand that temporary declines are simply part of the larger cycle of long-term growth. In fact, many experienced investors view market downturns as opportunities rather than threats, because lower prices allow them to acquire more shares of productive assets while continuing to build their long-term momentum. The real challenge is not mathematical but psychological, because human beings are naturally wired to react emotionally to uncertainty and short-term losses. This is why so many financial mistakes occur during moments of fear, when investors abandon long-term strategies in response to temporary market movements that ultimately recover over time. The investors who succeed over decades are rarely the ones with the most sophisticated strategies, but rather those who develop the discipline to remain calm when others panic and remain patient when progress feels slow. Once the crossover point arrives and compounding becomes a dominant force in your portfolio, the emotional landscape changes dramatically, because you no longer feel responsible for generating every dollar of growth through your own effort. Instead, you begin observing how time itself contributes to your progress through reinvested dividends, market appreciation, and the cumulative effect of decades of economic expansion. At this stage, the role of the investor becomes less about constant action and more about maintaining the structure that allows the system to continue operating effectively. You monitor your asset allocation, ensure that your investments remain diversified, and occasionally rebalance your portfolio to keep risk aligned with your goals. But the daily pressure to push the will disappears, because the system already possesses enough momentum to keep moving forward. This is the stage where many people begin exploring life decisions that once seemed impossible, because the financial foundation beneath them has become stable and resilient. Some choose to reduce their working hours, others transition into careers driven by passion rather than income, and some simply continue their professional paths with the confidence that they are no longer dependent on every paycheck for long-term security. The remarkable part is that all of these possibilities originate from a single mathematical principle that operates quietly in the background of every long-term investment portfolio. Compounding does not demand constant attention, dramatic decisions, or heroic effort once the initial foundation has been built. It simply requires time, consistency, and the patience to allow growth to accumulate year after year without unnecessary interference. When people finally understand this dynamic, they often realize that financial independence is less about reaching a specific number and more about reaching the moment when their investments generate enough momentum to sustain the trajectory they desire. That moment is the true turning point in the story of building wealth, because it transforms money from something you constantly chase into something that gradually begins working beside you, quietly multiplying in the background while you focus on designing the kind of life that originally inspired you to start investing in the first place. And when you finally reach that stage in your financial journey, where the numbers begin growing with a momentum that no longer depends entirely on your personal effort, something subtle but powerful changes in the way you see the world, because the constant pressure that once pushed you to optimize every dollar, every paycheck, and every decision slowly begins dissolving into a quieter sense of control and possibility. You start realizing that money was never meant to be the center of your life, but rather a tool that, when structured correctly, operates silently in the background while you spend your attention on things that actually give meaning to your days. For years, the narrative around wealth building convinces people that the only path forward is endless grinding, endless hustling, and endless sacrifice until some distant retirement date finally appears on the calendar. But the mathematics of compounding quietly reveals a different story that very few people stop to examine closely. The real turning point was never about reaching a specific age or following a rigid timeline created by someone else's expectations, because the true milestone is the moment your financial system becomes strong enough to support itself without constant input from you. Once that moment arrives, you are no longer simply a worker saving money for the future, but the owner of a financial engine that continues operating, whether you are actively thinking about it or not. And that realization often produces one final shift in perspective that many investors describe as the most liberating part of the entire journey. You stop asking how much more you need to sacrifice in order to reach the finish line faster, and you start asking what kind of life you want to build now that the system you created is already moving forward with its own momentum. Because in the end, the purpose of investing was never just to accumulate numbers inside an account, but to create freedom, flexibility, and the ability to make decisions based on what truly matters rather than what fear tells you is necessary. And once your portfolio begins growing faster than you can realistically contribute, once the wheel is spinning with enough force that it no longer depends on constant pushing, you finally understand the quiet truth behind long-term wealth. Money is no longer something you work for every single day of your life, because at that point it has finally begun working for you.